Hello. Hello, Vapor Central. Welcome back to the 2017 Normal Convention here at Vapor Central. We have the great John Conroy with us. He's going to say a few words. Here he is.
Thank you. Well, Jody, excellent speech.
Oh, thanks. I just get fired up.
I think she said it all. I think she took you through the whole thing and said it very well if it was in a manual of some kind so we can get people to follow the instruction, the experience that you've shown us. We lawyers can't do things without people like her on the front line, people who are willing to put their bodies on the line in order to advance the cause. As she says, if people don't get out there and keep after, it ends. And I don't like this C-45 Cannabis Act. I'm in front of them on Wednesday. They want me to talk about household cultivation, which of course will be simply a reiteration of how it can be done safely and reasonably and effectively, as was found by Judge Phelan in the Allard case after the police tried to go through all this extreme fear-mongering about fire, mold, and public safety. I mean, sure, there's going to be issues about apartments and, can you put bloom boxes in and landlords and tenants and all that stuff. But the Cannabis Act, actually, the definition of dwelling house includes the land surrounding the house and any buildings, outbuildings. So, it's going to be interesting to see some of the things that are in the Act. I'm trying to be optimistic. I mean, it's a step in the right direction. It's certainly not what I would call legalization, and I can't stand the criminal justice thing that's superimposed upon it. At least they've reduced the maximum penalty for trafficking from life to 14 years. 14 years. That's ridiculous. Ledane, when I was called to the bar in 1972, Ledane Commission was a report about cannabis in Canada. 72, 45 years ago. He said you should hybridize the offense of trafficking. By that I mean you have a summary conviction and an indictable offense. In the U.S., they call it felonies and misdemeanors. And so the max for a misdemeanor was going to be 6 months, and the max on indictment was going to be 5 years. Here we are, 45 years later, and their max is 14 years. And when it's 14 years, by the way, years ago we came up with something called the conditional sentence order to try and get judges to not put people in prison and to keep them in the community. They serve the sentence of imprisonment but in the community, house arrest type thing. You can't get that if there's a max of 14 years, thanks to the Harper crowd. And, people don't get anywhere near 14 years for trafficking or growing cannabis anymore. We have succeeded to a great extent in reducing huge numbers of prosecutions and arrests. One is too many, and you hear the experience and the consequences. But I used to get hundreds of people charged with various cannabis offenses. Hardly get any anymore. I'm winding down my practice and getting old and trying to retire. That's part of it. But other lawyers tell me the same thing. So, I remember that when I started practicing, people went to jail for possession. It was an odd time. I say odd because people really weren't that uptight about production and so on. And in the federal prison at Matsqui, near where I practice, they used to turn a blind eye to prisoners smoking pot and using pot because it kept the place calm. And then when they clamped down, everybody went back to opiates because they could flush that in 24 hours, whereas the cannabis would show up on the piss test for 90 days. So again, an illustration of how prohibition achieves the opposite to what they claim, and consequences that are just totally ridiculous. And it just baffles me that they continue to not see. I didn't see the press conference, but to hear that a minister talks about harm and secondhand smoke. Oh, God. You know, I just came back from BC where we've got smoke, all right. It's from forest fires and wind blowing, and it's the worst smoke you can possibly imagine. And in fact, I read it was at the Globe or somewhere fairly recently, like there's, 100,000 deaths a year or something from air pollution, and even more maybe. So, and they're worried about secondhand marijuana smoke. Give me a break. But anyway, this is a wrap-up. I'm going to be able to chat some more tomorrow and probably, as lawyers do, be more long-winded and go on and on. But I really enjoyed your speech, Jody. I think it was great. You need to listen. And on a positive note, I think the cannabis community is going to do just fine under this Cannabis Act. Sure, we'll have a few ticketing things happening and so on. The critical thing is the dispensary issue, because that's the whole issue about distribution and hopefully flooding the market so that there isn't any interest for people to get involved in the criminal side of it, so that the market is flooded. That's the only way. In Washington State, the mistake is the cost of setting up a store and the taxes have put the prices out of reach of most folks. So you have what happened earlier in Colorado, a guy on the street saying, hey, I'll sell it to you without the taxes. So you gotta get, they gotta get it, they gotta flood the market. With booze, we do, at least in BC, if I go to a liquor store, I pay 10% PST and I think 5% GST, so it's 15%. Which is reasonable. Some of these other states, it's like 25% and up, and they just create the black market. They just don't get it. And a big thing is, and it's going to be very interesting to see the difference between BC and Ontario. You heard Jody talk about the Ontario situation, and it's the city. Remember, it's the city that's really the problem here. It's the mayor and the police in Toronto that are behind all of this, more than the province, and certainly not the feds in terms of this particular issue, because in Vancouver, they're just putting them through the zoning and licensing schemes, and people are approved. And so how are they going to deal with that once, we're going to see what BC's model will be, and I doubt it'll be a liquor control board thing. But Washington State, the liquor control board licenses the stores, but still the costs and so on apparently are just ridiculous. So there's still a thriving black market. So that's the key thing, is getting rid of the black market and bringing everybody in. That's the part that I just shake my head. They are still, and I still advise people not to get involved because you'll prejudice yourself possibly in the future if you want to get involved. But there are all kinds of people out there, and they know what they're doing, and they are the business. Just get out there and get them to apply for licenses, and let's get them taxed and regulated. What's so difficult about this? It's really not difficult at all. But like Jody, after all these years, and for me it's now been at least 45, I still don't get, well, I sort of do get where a lot of it comes from. And, if you think about all the stuff that went through the media in the early days, and even Maclean's magazine and things like that, that really created this reefer madness attitude amongst so many people and this fear. But again, as Jody said, we now know that, and we have double-blind, placebo-based studies that say that cannabis is a significant exit strategy drug in the opiate crisis. And that really was a very important point I think you made in terms of what can be done to stop hundreds of people dying every month in Vancouver in particular, and I think here in Toronto as well. So anyway, I could go on and on. Hope to see a lot of you back tomorrow, and let's deal with this new act as it comes along and show them that we can do it, and don't do things to stink out the neighborhood or things that upset people. Do things to bring people on side so that we can show them that this is just step one and we need to get rid of the criminal law completely in this whole area. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's the end of our programming today. Come back tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Sarah Hanlon's taking over. She's going to do a much better job than I did today.